Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. In this video, we will tell the story of Plato, not as an abstract figure from a textbook, but as a living man who sought order in chaos, meaning in life, and philosophy in the very way of living. He is one of the most influential thinkers in the entire history of humankind, a disciple of Socrates, a teacher of Aristotle, the founder of the Academy, the creator of the theory of ideas, a man who forever changed the way we think about the soul, truth, and justice. You will learn why the death of Socrates became a turning point in his destiny, how Plato tried to bring philosophy into real politics and almost lost his life, why the soul matters and how an ideal state should be built, and why Plato became the true beginning of all Western philosophy. This is not just a biography. It is the story of how one life changed the course of thought for thousands of years. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. When in the 428th or 427th year before our era, a boy named Aristocles was born in Athens. His birth marked the continuation of an ancient and noble line. He came from a family belonging to the highest Athenian class, whose roots traced back both to the legendary King Codrus, the last mythical ruler of Attica, and to Solon, the renowned lawgiver, poet, and reformer, whose name still commanded respect a century after his death. The boy's father, Ariston, was traditionally said to descend from Harmodius and from distant descendants of Poseidon, while his mother, Perictione, was related to Solon and possibly to other members of the Athenian intellectual elite. It was a household in which ancient nobility intertwined with a love of thought, the tradition of valor with the spirit of reflection. From childhood, the future philosopher was surrounded by a world full of political upheavals, cultural richness, and spiritual searching. Athens had not yet recovered from the Peloponnesian War, but still remained a center of learning and art. In this city, where democracy lived side by side with demagogy, where refined tragedy coexisted with aggressive rhetoric, young Aristocles grew observant and thoughtful. Later, because of his broad shoulders and strong build, he received the nickname Plato, from the Greek Platos, meaning broad. The nickname quickly replaced his real name, under which no one remembers him anymore. At an early age, Plato received a strict but well-rounded education. His first teacher of grammar, according to tradition, was Dionysius, who taught him writing, poetry, and literary style. Then came a music teacher, known as Meton or Draken, who taught him to play the lyre and explain the link between musical modes and the inner state of the soul. Later came lessons in gymnastics, drawing, rhetoric, and metrics. Education in his home was never merely formal. Plato grew up where discussions of politics, religion, and philosophy were part of daily life. After his father's death, Plato's mother remarried Pyrilamp, a man who had been an ambassador at the Persian court and a close associate of Pericles, the leading statesman of Athens. This meant that from an early age the boy moved among the political and intellectual elite, witnessing debates, listening to speeches, and learning how decisions were shaped. His brothers Glaucon and Adeimantus participated in public affairs, and among their relatives were members of the oligarchic group connected to the rule of the 30 Tyrants, the harsh pro-Spartan junta that seized power in Athens after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. These experiences left their mark on Plato, not in the form of political ambition, but as a desire to understand what justice is, and whether evil can be prevented by the power of thought and law. Yet the most decisive event of his youth was his meeting with Socrates. No one knows under what circumstances it happened, perhaps during one of Socrates' public conversations in the Agora, or through mutual acquaintances, but by the age of 20, Plato had become not only a regular listener, but a participant in Socratic dialogues. He was neither the first nor the last of Socrates' disciples, but he was the one who, in his own words, learned not only how to reason, but how to live. Socrates, barefoot, reserved, ironic, indifferent to rhetorical ornament or outward signs of learning, amazed everyone by asking questions that seemed long answered. He dictated no truths, but led others toward them, often destroying the illusion of knowledge and leaving a person face to face with their own ignorance. Plato was deeply moved by this philosophy. He saw how Socrates debated with craftsmen, sophists, politicians, and youths, never losing patience, never seeking victory, but always seeking understanding. In one conversation, according to tradition, Socrates said to his students, "He is not wise who knows many things, but he who knows that he does not know." This simple phrase, Plato admitted, changed him profoundly. he realized that the task of philosophy was not to assert but to inquire. There is a story that Socrates once told Plato to observe a carpenter at work, to show how even a craftsman without philosophical training instinctively follows an inner notion of the right form, measuring, adjusting, and shaping objects not only for use, but according to harmony. Whether true or allegorical, such moments taught Plato to distinguish between things seen and things thought, between what exists physically and what exists as an idea. He began recording dialogues with Socrates while his teacher was still alive, not for fame, but to preserve memory, accurate and vivid. His early writings have not survived, but it is known that as a youth, he attempted tragedies, hymns, and poems, and abandoned them once he understood that the path to truth lay not through inspiration, but through investigation. Yet even then, Plato was not a blind admirer. He began to notice the limits of Socratic aporia, that method by which every answer turns into a new question. He asked himself about the nature of knowledge, about whether good could be truly known, about what justice meant if everyone understood it differently. He absorbed not only Socratic reasoning, but the honesty behind the confession, "I know that I know nothing." And in that, he found the beginning of philosophy as a lifelong vocation. Thus, his youth passed, not in a quiet school, but in the streets of Athens, in heated debates, in the assemblies and courts, in the reading of poets, and the silence of inner reflection. In that noisy, ever-changing city, he sought the eternal and began to find it. For Plato, the day Socrates was sentenced to death was not only the loss of a teacher, but an inner collapse, an event after which old ideas about justice, the state, and reason could no longer stand. In the 399th year before our era, the Athenian court found Socrates guilty of disrespecting the city's gods and of corrupting the youth. The punishment, death by drinking poison, became the final act of a long-growing public mistrust toward a man who, though holding no office or school, influenced the minds of citizens more deeply than orators or politicians. Plato witnessed the trial, heard the distortions, half-truths, and demagoguery, not as a distant observer, but as a student. Socrates could have escaped. He had the chance to leave Athens before the trial. His friends were ready to arrange his flight and pay the way. But he refused. He stayed, not because he accepted the verdict, but because he believed that a citizen has no right to break the laws, even when the laws act unjustly. Plato, by his own account, was not present at the moment of execution, probably due to illness, but he knew every detail. He knew that Socrates spent his last hours calmly, surrounded by friends, discussing the immortality of the soul, reflecting on death, and leaving a final request, to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, as a symbol of gratitude for a cure, perhaps from life itself. This death became not just a personal loss, but a philosophical turning point. Plato began to ask, what kind of society condemns a man for seeking truth? What is wrong with democracy, if it can vote to execute Socrates? He had no answers yet, but he felt one thing: he could not remain in Athens. And so, he left. His first refuge was Megara, home of Euclid, one of Socrates' closest disciples, who, according to Diogenes Laertius, sheltered Plato right after the trial. There, in silence, far from political passions, Plato may have begun his first writings, not as finished works, but as sketches meant to preserve not only Socrates' words, but his spirit. But he did not stay long. He longed to see how other people thought beyond Attica. He set out west, to Magna Graecia, as the Greek colonies of southern Italy were called. In Tarentum, tradition says, he met Archytas, a great mathematician, statesman, and follower of the Pythagorean school. Archytas was both scholar and ruler, governing his city through reason and proportion. Plato was struck by how the Pythagoreans saw numbers not as abstractions, but as living structures of the world, the foundation of cosmos and soul. They studied harmony, musical intervals, and ratios that expressed not only sounds, but universal proportions. These ideas, that behind all sense lies something immaterial, ordered, and eternal, prepared the soil for his future theory of ideas. From Tarentum he sailed to Sicily, to Syracuse, a rich and powerful city ruled by tyrants from the family of Dionysius. Here, for the first time, he encountered rulers who tried to use philosophy for power. According to some accounts, he quarreled openly with Dionysius the Elder, telling him that a ruler without virtue can never be truly wise. The result was immediate. By some versions he was expelled, by others sold into slavery. Diogenes Laertius recounts that he was indeed sold on the island of Aegina and ransomed by Anicetus of Cyrene, a poet and philosopher who recognized in him not property, but a rare mind. After his return from Sicily, ancient authors say, Plato may have visited Egypt. Though evidence is scarce, antiquity firmly believed he had spoken with the priests of Memphis and Heliopolis, studied their doctrines of the soul and cosmos, and marveled at the antiquity of their rites and writing. Later, in Timaeus, Plato tells the story of Atlantis, attributing it to Egyptian priests who had once spoken with Solon. Whether or not this was a literary device, it shows how deeply Egyptian wisdom entered his intellectual world. Whatever the exact details, these years of wandering became his time of inner formation. He was no longer simply Socrates' pupil, nor merely an Athenian. He had become a thinker aware of the vastness of the world, both philosophical and cultural. He had seen that people everywhere sought truth, some in numbers, some in rituals, some in laws. And he began to sense that truth itself is born not in one place, but where many paths meet. When he finally returned to Athens, he no longer wanted merely to continue Socrates' tradition. He knew a new step was needed. Philosophy must not only destroy false opinions, but also build a foundation for knowledge, ethics, and education. And for that, he decided to create a place where philosophy would become not an accident of encounter, but a way of life. When Plato returned to Athens after many years of travel and reflection, the city greeted him with the familiar noise of the agora, the ringing of forges, the voices of sophists, and the rhythmic exercises of gymnasia under the ancient trees. Yet deep within, he felt that he had come back to a different place. Athens was the same, full of speech, contests, and festivals. But to him, it had become something else. Not a stage for action, but the birthplace of a new mission. Philosophy as a disciplined, lifelong pursuit. Around the 387th year before our era, Plato founded a philosophical school that would become the first institutional center of philosophy in history. He chose a grove beyond the city walls, northwest of Athens, dedicated to the hero Academus. The place was called Academia, and thus the school became known as Plato's Academy. Beneath the old trees, near ancient altars once used for sacred games and training, people now gathered not to speak of the strength of the body, but of the movement of the soul. It is said that the land was either purchased by Plato or given to him by a friend, perhaps by the same Anicetus of Cyrene who had once redeemed him from slavery. More likely, the academy had no formal ownership at all. It was not an official institution nor state-funded, but a community, a circle of disciples gathered around a teacher who sought not to transmit knowledge, but to awaken thought. What made the academy new was that philosophy, for the first time, gained a home, a fixed place where one could not only talk, but live philosophically. The sophists, brilliant orators and paid teachers, traveled from city to city. Socrates had spoken in the streets, despising formal instruction, but Plato saw the need for stability. Thought should not depend on chance, but have its own foundation. In the academy, philosophy became not a casual conversation, but a continuous process, an inquiry that never ended with ready-made answers, but cultivated the inner faculty of searching. The students came from all over, from Athens, other Greek cities, even from Macedonia and Asia Minor. Among the earliest were Speusippus, Plato's energetic and systematic nephew, Xenocrates, serious and contemplative, and Philip of Opus, who may have edited Plato's late works. Some would later lead the school. Others would found their own. The most famous, though arriving 2 decades later, would be Aristotle of Stagira, who studied there until Plato's death. But that is another story. The Academy's program was built on the idea of the mind's gradual ascent. Plato believed philosophy was impossible without preparation. The intellect must pass through disciplines that train abstraction and precision. Thus students studied arithmetic, geometry, stereometry, astronomy, and music, not as performance, but as the science of numerical and harmonic order. These, he said, purify the mind from the sensory and accustom it to the immaterial. Only after that can one approach dialectic, the highest form of inquiry through which the soul seeks truth. An inscription, perhaps apocryphal, was said to hang above the entrance. "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Whether or not it really existed, it captured the spirit of the place, that thinking begins when one can rise above opinion, custom, and fear of difficulty. Lessons were dialogues, Students debated opposing views, learning not to repeat their master but to test every thought. Classes varied, sometimes in the shade of trees, walking in circles and discussing complex questions, sometimes indoors, reading Homer or Pindar, analyzing sophistic arguments, or reflecting on Socratic dialogues. Plato rarely lectured. He listened, questioned, and guided. One story says that after hearing a student repeat his words too easily, Plato said, "If you understood it so quickly, then you did not understand at all." The academy lived not as a school in the formal sense, but as a way of life. Students ate together, walked together, joined in rituals and exercises, discussed philosophy, politics, and poetry. Travelers and rulers occasionally visited, curious about this strange place where young men sat beneath trees discussing the nature of justice, the structure of the soul, and the essence of number. Yet the academy was never detached from reality. Plato wanted philosophy to help build a better world. In the surviving letters, whether authentic or not, we sense his concern for cities, his attempts to advise rulers, his proposals for reform. But he increasingly realized that no change would last unless the human being changed first, unless reason was trained, purified from passion and habit. The academy, he believed, must be the place for that transformation, not for a day or a century, but for all time. In the evenings when the debates ended and students went home, Plato often remained alone, with his wax tablet and stylus, recording the thoughts that would become his dialogues. He knew that the death of Socrates must not be forgotten. He believed that truth needs form, a school, and memory. In that sense, the academy was not just a school. It was a temple of thought, the place where philosophy found its body and its voice. Plato's philosophy did not arise as an abstract theory, but as the result of a long path, a path of observation, conversation, doubt, and remembrance of a teacher whose death revealed how fragile human judgments are and how dangerous ignorance can be when masked by certainty. If Socrates left behind the unsettling feeling of not knowing, Plato sought to make that not knowing a point of support for a new kind of thinking capable of distinguishing appearance from essence. His reflections led him to the conviction that the world open to our senses cannot be the final instance of being, because it is in continual flux, subject to coming to be and passing away, marked by imperfection, and therefore cannot be the source of stable and universal knowledge. From this conclusion grew the central tenet of all Platonic philosophy, the doctrine of Id, or ideas, immaterial, eternal, and unchanging essences that exist independently of sensible objects. For Plato, the ideas are the true reality, whereas everything we see, hear, or touch is only their incomplete, temporary, and distorted reflection. Behind anything, a table, a tree, or a human being, stands its idea, a perfect archetype that cannot be destroyed, altered, or lost. It is precisely for this reason that we can recognize form across different objects, feel beauty in different bodies, and perceive justice in different deeds. The soul can discern, within the particular, the glimmer of the eternal. To explain how the soul can have access to these invisible essences, Plato develops the notion of the soul's pre-existence, according to which the soul existed before it was embodied, and directly contemplated the ideas. Birth into the world is, for Plato, not a beginning, but a forgetting, a kind of fall of the soul from the realm of pure being into the domain of becoming. Human cognition is therefore not so much the acquisition of something new as the recollection, anamnesis, of what the soul already knew before its earthly existence. This is why Plato holds it possible to awaken truth within the person without direct instruction. The task of the philosopher is not to teach, but to guide toward remembering, cleansing consciousness of errors imposed by the senses and by everyday opinion. To make vivid how deceptive sense perception can be, and how arduous the ascent to true knowledge, Plato presents in the Republic a famous image that has become one of the most influential allegories in history, the parable of the cave. He asks us to imagine people chained in a cave from childhood so that they can see only the wall before them. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners people pass with objects whose shadows are cast upon the wall. These shadows are all the prisoners ever see, and they take them for reality. One prisoner is freed, emerges into the open, and, with difficulty, through blinding light, gradually learns to see things themselves, and at last, the sun, the source of light and life. Returning to the cave, He tries to explain that the shadows are a deception, but he is not understood. They laugh at him, and may even be ready to kill him. This allegory contains Plato's key ideas. The cave is the world of sensory experience. The shadows are images, opinions, and judgments that people mistake for truth. The sun is the idea of the good, the highest principle, the source of knowledge, order, and being. The freed prisoner is the philosopher who overcomes the deceit of the senses and ascends to truth. Yet his return brings alienation and hostility, because most people do not wish to hear about a world to which they are unaccustomed. The parable shows not only the structure of cognition, but also the fate of the truth seeker, the difficulty, solitude, and risk bound up with the philosophical calling. The path to the ideas, however, is neither straight nor swift. Plato develops a layered structure of knowing in which each new insight must rest upon forms of thinking already purified and prepared. In the Republic, he describes a divided line of cognition. First imagination, then belief, then discursive understanding, and finally, reason. The highest stage is dialectic, the art of leading thought from the particular to the universal and from universal principles to the first principle, which is the idea of the good. Without the good, Plato insists, nothing can be truly known. Just as the eye cannot see without light, so the mind cannot think without the presence of the good. This good is not merely a moral quality. It is the fundamental ground of all that is, the beginning and the summit of philosophical ascent. Plato's manner of exposition has a special place in his philosophy. He almost never speaks in his own voice. His main ideas appear in dialogues in which the chief speakers, most often Socrates and his companions, reason, doubt, and argue with one another. This form reflects the very principle of Platonic thinking. Truth is not imposed, but is born in movement, in the interaction of different positions, in the inner tension of the question. For this reason, Platonic dialogues rarely end with a clear conclusion. What matters is not the terminus, but the path. Some have thought Plato deliberately concealed any positive doctrine in the fabric of literary conversation, so that the reader would not merely receive the content but would undergo the path of thought personally. In addition to the dialogues, there are the so-called letters, some of which are ascribed to Plato, though their authenticity is debated. The most significant is the seventh letter, which reflects on the impossibility of transmitting the deepest philosophical knowledge in written form. According to its author, true knowledge arises not from texts, but from an inner illumination born of live conversation, when a soul, long prepared, suddenly grasps the essence. These lines agree with the remark in the Phaedrus, where Socrates says that writing is but a reminder, not a teaching, for what is written cannot answer, defend itself, or deepen. Perhaps for this reason Plato taught in the Academy orally, passing on what could not be written without distortion. Plato's ideas constitute not only a metaphysics, but a distinctive way of perceiving the world, in which the sensible is only a step toward the intelligible, and knowledge is not a sum of facts, but a remembering of what the soul once already knew. In this light, philosophy becomes not a science and not a system, but a process of purification and elevation, by which a person learns to see the inner behind the outer, the universal behind the particular, the eternal behind the temporal. In this, Plato saw the highest goal of education and philosophy, the turning of the soul toward true reality. When in the Republic, Plato began to construct the image of an ideal polis, he did not seek to draft a political program fit for immediate implementation, or to propose a practical utopia. Rather, he undertook a philosophical experiment in which the logic of the soul, the structure of knowledge, and the ordering of society formed a single, continuous figure of thought, a city ruled by reason. If earlier dialogues dealt chiefly with the nature of knowledge and with justice in the individual, here the scale changed. Socrates and his interlocutors tried to understand what an entire city must be like if truth, and not passion, whim, or arbitrariness, governs within it. The conversation begins with a simple question: what is justice? And gradually moves from the individual soul to political order. The participants, among them Plato's brothers Glaucon and Adimantus as the most active speakers, agreed to examine justice on a larger canvas, in the city, where it might be clearer than in a single soul. From that point, they build a hypothetical polis, first in the simplest outlines, then in increasing complexity, until it becomes a coherent model of an ideal society in which each element corresponds to a level of being and a function. Plato proposes a three-part structure for both soul and society. The soul, in his view, consists of the rational, the spirited or volitional, and the appetitive parts. Accordingly, in the state, there are three classes: philosopher rulers, moved by knowledge and love of truth; guardians, whose task is to protect the city with courage and loyalty; and producers, farmers, artisans, and merchants, who provide the material needs of the community. Justice in such an order means that each part performs its proper function without intruding on the others, and, in the soul, that reason governs, spirit supports, and desire obeys. At the center of this order stands the philosopher ruler, one who possesses not only knowledge of the ideas, but also the virtues necessary for rule. He does not seek power, advantage, or fame. Precisely for that reason, he alone is worthy to govern. Plato emphasizes that the state will be just only when either philosophers become rulers or rulers become true philosophers. This does not mean that every thoughtful person must rule. Rather, it refers to those capable of grasping the idea of the good, the highest peak of the Platonic hierarchy of being, the source of all that exists, and the condition of any knowing. To educate such rulers, a carefully designed system is required, beginning in childhood and continuing until the age of 50. Education starts with gymnastics and musical training, encompassing rhythm, harmony, poetry, and myth, not for the sake of aesthetics, but to form character. Then, at about the age of 20, young people study mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and harmonic theory as disciplines that train abstract thought. After 30, they are admitted to dialectic, the capacity to think logically and to see connections among ideas. Only after 15 years of service in public and political life, at around 50 years of age, may the best begin to contemplate the idea of the good and be called to rule. Thus, for Plato, philosophical education is not a course of lectures, but a path that purifies the soul and develops the mind until it can perceive the eternal within the changing. One of the most radical features of the Republic is the proposal that guardians and rulers hold property and family in common. Plato thinks that private possessions, including money and even blood ties, can undermine service to the common good. He therefore proposes to abolish private property for these two classes, to replace individual marriages with arranged unions conducted as a kind of public right, to allow the best men and women to continue the line, and to have children raised in common institutions without knowledge of their parents. Such education, he believes, will free them from partiality, family intrigue, and the accident of inherited power. In this project, the distinction between utility and truth is crucial. The interlocutors repeatedly try to set justice against advantage. If the just man is poor and the unjust rich, does this not show justice to be unprofitable? Plato replies that justice is not an instrument or a means to external success. It is an inner order of the soul. Even if the just person suffers, he remains in concord with himself, whereas the unjust, even if successful, is inwardly ruined. Truth stands higher than usefulness because it makes harmony possible, without which there is neither happiness, nor stability, nor meaning. Knowing that the ideal state has likely never existed and may never exist, Plato does not leave the discussion in abstraction. In the final books of the Republic, he describes degenerate forms of regime that arise as the ideal erodes. First, aristocracy, the rule of the best, gives way to timocracy, where honor and military valor dominate. Then comes oligarchy, founded on wealth. After it, democracy, where freedom reigns, but order is lacking. And finally, tyranny, in which one man subjugates all. This sequence is not a historical chronology, but a philosophical warning. When reason loses control, society slides toward chaos. Thus, the Republic is not merely a book about politics, but a complex work in which metaphysics, psychology, ethics, and pedagogy are woven into one. It is neither a utopia in the sense of an unattainable dream, nor a program of reform. It is an image by which we can perceive the limits of the possible and recognize departures from inner measure. Plato constructs not a city on earth, but an intellectual city, a standard by which to gauge the movement of one's own soul and the deeds of human communities. Its power lies here. It offers no instant recipes, but sets a point toward which we can strive, even knowing it will always remain ahead. When Plato first declared that power ought to belong to philosophers, he knew how much this assertion contradicted the usual course of things. Even so, he nourished a hope that, if circumstances aligned, rulership and reason could be joined, and that the just state, outlined in the Republic, might not remain forever, a thought experiment. That hope took on a concrete form when Plato became entangled in events that would test his philosophy against the reality of power. It all unfolded not in Athens but far to the west, on the island of Sicily, in one of the richest and most powerful Greek cities, Syracuse. The first contacts between Plato and the Syracusan court date to the early 380s before our era, soon after the death of Dionysius I, though their groundwork had been laid earlier. After his travels in Italy and his acquaintance with the Pythagoreans, Plato had begun to attract the attention of politically active circles in the Greek West. Dion, a noble Syracusan, kinsman of the ruling house, educated, ambitious, and deeply impressed by Plato's philosophy, played a special role. He saw in his teacher not merely a theorist, but someone who could instruct a ruler and help transform the state. Plato first visited Syracuse during the life of Dionysius I, around the 388th year before our era. The ruler, harsh and suspicious by temperament, nonetheless, like many tyrants of the time, patronized science, rhetoric, and poetry. By one account, Plato came not by the tyrant's invitation but at Dion's urging, in the hope that the philosopher might influence the monarch. At first, Plato was received with honor, joined conversations, and according to tradition stated, even if cautiously, that only justice and wisdom make a ruler truly great. Such speech roused irritation. Accustomed to admiration and obedience, Dionysius soon felt threatened by the philosopher. The sources, including Diogenes Laertius, report that Plato was expelled from the island and on his return journey was seized on Aegina, hostile to Athens, and sold into slavery. This was possible because a long, bitter war still smoldered among the cities, and the name of an Athenian, even a great one, stirred no pity. Plato was indeed put up for sale as a prisoner of war, but Anicetus of Cyrene, a philosopher and wealthy admirer of Platonism, recognized him and ransomed him, it is said, not to keep him but to donate the sum to the academy. Plato refused to accept the money, and the entire ransom went to the school. However enshrined in legend, the episode became a symbol. A philosopher who had become a slave preserved inner freedom and dignity. Nearly 2 decades later, in the 367th year before our era, after the death of Dionysius I, power in Syracuse passed to his son, Dionysius II, young, inexperienced, and swayed by the court. Dion, who remained at court, saw an opening. If the new ruler could be educated in philosophy, perhaps one city could, step by step, be reformed. He sent for Plato once more, begging him to come and instruct Dionysius. Plato hesitated for a long time. In his letters, especially the 7th letter, he candidly writes that he did not wish to go, did not believe in success, and feared a trap. But friends and students prevailed upon him, and above all the thought that perhaps, somewhere, philosophy might hold power, not only in words, but in deeds. Plato sailed again to Syracuse, not as a diplomat or courtier, but as a teacher seeking to realize the central claim of his philosophy. At first, Dionysius II showed interest, listened to lectures, and conversed with zeal. He even made attempts at reform. He curtailed luxury at court, tried to limit expenditures, and admitted philosophers to his private council. Yet attachment to power, fear of losing position, distrust of Dion, and the intrigues of the court soon took their toll. He began to sideline Dion, accuse him of conspiracy, and at length banished him. Plato found himself in danger, caught between the ruler's anger and loyalty to his pupil. He tried diplomacy, to keep Dionysius's favor, to persuade him to recall Dion, to preserve influence. Gradually it became clear that no ideal state would arise there. Plato remained in Syracuse longer than he intended. He was not a prisoner in the strict sense, but he could leave only with permission. Matters were complicated by the fact that a return to Athens could be taken as a diplomatic insult, whereas his presence at court could be seen as silent approval. Only through the mediation of Archytas of Tarentum, the Pythagorean with whom Plato had been in contact in southern Italy, and other friends was he allowed to depart. In the 361st year before our era, Plato left Sicily. It was his 3rd and final sojourn in Syracuse. Dionysius continued to rule but lost popular support and was eventually deposed. Dion returned a few years later with a band of mercenaries, overthrew Dionysius, and soon fell himself to conspiracy. Plato, observing these events from Athens, did not comment publicly, but in his letters, especially the 7th, which many scholars take to contain personal avowals, he made it plain. The attempt to join philosophy and power had failed. The failure did not destroy the Platonic ideal, but it changed the tone of his reflections. Back in Athens, he continued to lead the academy. yet grew more restrained in his assessment of what philosophy can do in politics. In his later works, he gives greater weight to laws, education, and stable institutions rather than to the figure of a wise ruler. He understood that human nature and political passions do not yield to a single effort at reform, and that a durable polity can be built only through a sustained, years-long education of citizens beginning from first principles. When Plato returned to Athens after his third and final visit to Syracuse, he was no longer a youth dreaming of an ideal philosophical republic, nor a mature political mentor striving to influence rulers, but a man who had tested the limits of applying philosophy to real power and who, without abandoning its principles, sought a different field for it. In this concluding stage of life, he concentrated increasingly on systematizing and completing his teaching, recognizing that the essential task was not a personal political victory, but the preservation of a tradition of thought, passed on through speech and education, capable of transforming a person from within. By then, the academy, which he had founded in the 4th century before our era, had grown from a small philosophical fellowship into a stable intellectual center, drawing young people from many cities of Hellas. Plato no longer debated in the agora, wrote political letters, or sought outward influence. He continued to teach, to listen, to edit dialogues, and to converse with students, in the shade of plane trees, along the school's colonnades amid the hum of daily life that seemed to run alongside but never disturb the inner current of philosophical work. During this period, he produced his most mature and conceptually demanding works, dialogues that not only round off his system but also show how it had been reshaped by lived experience. They differ from the dialogues of his youth and middle years by a heavier style, a less pronounced dramatic form, and the absence of Socrates as an active participant, though Socrates had earlier been both hero and symbol of Platonic philosophy. Now Plato himself assumes the role of impersonal narrator, a philosopher speaking in the name of an entire generation of thinkers. One such dialogue, Timaeus, occupies a special place in Plato's system. In it, he for the first time presents a systematic cosmology, where philosophy joins mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and metaphysics. The central speaker is Timaeus of Locri, a figure perhaps half mythical, reflecting Pythagorean influence. Timaeus explains how the world is ordered, how the demiurge, a good and rational craftsman, does not create out of nothing but orders pre-existent chaotic matter, contemplating the eternal ideas and aiming to make the sensible world as much as possible like the intelligible. The universe, for Plato, is a living, unsouled being, structured by the laws of number and geometry. The soul of the cosmos is set at the center. The body is subject to motion, and time arises as an imitation of eternity, one of Timaeus's key formulas. Plato describes the origin of the elements, the structure of the heavens, the formation of the human body and soul, the causes of illness, and the means of healing. Everything in this dialogue is governed by harmony, symmetry, and proportion, from the placement of the senses to the tally of days in an ideal year. Yet beneath the surface, scientific tone lies a profound philosophical intent, to show that reason, penetrating the world, discovers not chaos but order, not accident but design. Timaeus became one of the most influential texts of antiquity and the Middle Ages. It was received as a metaphysical and almost theological teaching. Yet Plato himself stresses in the dialogue that he offers not certain knowledge but a likely story, eikos logos, a reasoned account that approaches truth as closely as possible without claiming final proof. Another central work of this period is Laws, his longest and arguably most methodical dialogue. Here, Plato moves away from the image of the ideal polis of the Republic and considers how a real state might be ordered when philosophers do not rule. 3 elderly interlocutors take part, one from Athens, one from Cretan Knossos, and one formed by the Spartan tradition. Slowly and step by step, they discuss the constitution of a future city, Magnesia, to be founded on just laws, moderation, and education. In Laws, Plato no longer insists on the community of wives and children or on abolishing private property. He acknowledges the limits of human nature, the weakness of the majority, and the need for compromise. In place of the unattainable ideal, he proposes a project for a second-best city, grounded not in absolute wisdom but in prudent governance, in a balance of law and custom. He pays particular attention to the role of music, rhythm, physical training, religious festivals, and shared ritual as means of forming moral sense and civic loyalty. Unlike the earlier dialogues, Laws abounds in concrete statutes and prescriptions, from rules of marriage to the conduct of legal proceedings. Plato considers not only what a law ought to be, but how it ought to act upon a human being, instilling respect for order, a sense of measure, fear of punishment, and a desire to follow the better, not from fear, but from understanding. He admits that the ideal is unattainable, yet does not take this as a reason to abandon striving for the best achievable order. Plato did not complete Laws. The final books were likely written by his students, especially Philip of Opus. Even unfinished, the dialogue stands as the culmination of Plato's reflections on practical politics, on the limits of philosophy and affairs of state, and on how, through education and law, one might approach justice without fully attaining it. Plato spent his last years in the academy. He took no part in politics, wrote no new letters to tyrants, and did not return to active polemic with the sophists. He taught, dictated, edited texts, discussed intricate metaphysical schemes with his students, and watched a younger generation take up, argue with, and continue his teaching. Among these students was Aristotle, whose influence would be immense, yet for the time being Plato remained the school's center, not as a domineering master but as a source. Several accounts of his death survive. Some say he died in his sleep, others at a banquet while listening to music, still others alone in deep old age. The commonly accepted date is the 347th year before our era. He was about 80 years old. He died at a time when his academy was flourishing, his ideas were known throughout Hellas, and his works were beginning to pass from living speech into canonical text. Even after his death, in Athenian memory, he remained not only the author of books and mentor of youth, but a man who tried not merely to speak about justice, but to seek a place for it in life. His writings, from dialogues on virtue to cosmological constructions, were never mere exercises. They were attempts to build a bridge between the eternal and the human, between the intelligible order and the imperfect world that nevertheless strives toward it. When Plato departed this life, the academy did not collapse or vanish. On the contrary, it continued as a living intellectual community founded not on a charter or a building, but on a method, a vision, and a tradition of inquiry in which every word was a challenge, every hypothesis an occasion for refinement, and every argument a chance to move one step nearer to truth. His death was not an ending, because figures had long since formed around him who had not merely absorbed his ideas but followed their own path. Among them the man destined not so much to continue Plato as to inaugurate a new direction in thought, Aristotle. Aristotle came to the academy in youth and remained there for almost 20 years. He arrived from Stagira, a northern Greek city, and despite his foreign birth quickly became one of the most capable and attentive students. He possessed a lively, observant mind, extraordinary diligence, and a drive for systematization. Although Plato esteemed Aristotle highly, philosophical differences appeared fairly early between them. These did not become personal conflict, yet with time they grew fundamental. Aristotle revered Plato as his teacher, yet he was the first to criticize Plato's doctrine in a systematic way, especially the theory of ideas that undergirded all of Platonism. For Plato, the idea exists apart from the thing, a perfect archetype in another, intelligible realm. Aristotle held that a thing's essence is not separate from the thing itself. It is manifested in its form and function. He cared less for seeking eternal patterns beyond phenomena than for understanding how phenomena are structured from within. He exchanged the Platonic turn toward another world for attention to form, cause, end, and motion. In effect, he set philosophy upon the earth, without denying what is highest, but insisting that knowledge begins not with separation, but with observation. After Plato's death, the academy was headed by Speusippus, his nephew, a philosopher who aimed to preserve the school's teaching within a moderate Platonism. Aristotle did not remain. His path evidently required a different framework. Though respectful of the school, he did not share all its tenets. He left Athens, and only many years later would found his own school, the Lyceum. Still, it was within the academy that he underwent the training that formed him as a philosopher. Despite differences with his pupils, Plato did not strive to construct a closed and final philosophical system. His dialogues remained open, many-voiced, designed less to secure agreement than to provoke thinking. He did not instruct others how to live. He showed how to frame questions. He did not dictate answers. He built a space in which answers could be born from tension, doubt, and clarification. The academy outlived its founder by almost 9 centuries, transmitting not only his doctrines but the very form of inquiry, in conversation, in logic, in reverence for a truth that belongs to no one. From this form emerged not merely schools of philosophers, but the very idea of the university as a place where knowledge does not close upon itself, but breathes. In its halls, Aristotle took shape and went his own way. So did dozens of other students whose names have faded, though their part was woven into the larger design. However far the paths of the pupils led, Plato's shadow remained over them, not as an authority that crushes thought, but as a figure pointing out that truth lies not in victory over an interlocutor, but in the power to listen, to reason, and to seek. He fashioned a philosophy in which one strives not for power and fame, but for knowledge and virtue, so that life might be brought into accord with reason. Plato departed, but his words remained. His academy was destroyed, yet his ideas lived on in temples and schools, in monasteries and universities, in the works of theologians and scholars. He did not strive for immortality, and yet he attained it, not only in books, but in our manner of thinking, speaking, and doubting. For Plato is not only a philosopher, but the very image of philosophy, a philosophy that never grants the last word.